Hey everyone, welcome back to the arena. I'm Mike David, joined by Matt Kovachis, and once again a very special guest. If you're new here, welcome to our arena, a space in which we delve into deep conversations around people's life stories and all things health and wellness. These conversations are deep and are meant to inspire others to tap into their own vulnerabilities. I'll pass it over to Matt shortly to say hello and introduce our guest. Before I do, it's love and appreciation to those who are listening. And if you know anyone who is not listening, do send this conversation their way if you think it could be of value. Thanks. Over you, Matt.
What's up? What's up? We got another fun guest here. We have Elizabeth. I don't even know Elizabeth's last name, guys, to be honest. I actually made the assumption that her name is Elizabeth based on her profile that it says Eatlizabeth. Made the crazy assumption. I hope I'm right. She's a content creator in Chicago, podcast host of a new podcast, the Actually Okay podcast. And I think what drew me to Elizabeth's profile and to inquire to come on the show was one, Chicago. I mean, gotta appreciate that. But two, I think just like the openness around the journey. I think social media for a lot of people, we highlight our wins and what's going right, and I definitely got more of a sense of like we're gonna see it all, the good and the bad, and I think that's life, and it's more real and it's more resonant with people. So why don't we start with who is, normally I'd say the full name, but I don't even know the full name. So who is Elizabeth?
Well, thank you both so much for having me on. Yes, my name's Elizabeth. I also live here in Chicago, and I'm 28. I would like to think I live a pretty average, normal life. I work a corporate 9 to 5, and I just happen to make content on the side as a hobby. And I also just happen to be an alcoholic who got sober a little over 2 years ago. And so I'd say most of my content now just orients around what it's like to be in recovery. And my main goal is really just normalizing being an alcoholic and not feeling like it's something that has to be shameful.
Can you take us back to the onset? Like where should we start? I would love to learn more about your journey towards sobriety, but also like where maybe you felt like, oh, this is a problem. Just like talk us through the journey from start to finish, but where do we need to start?
Yeah, totally. Well, everyone has their own thoughts about it. I truly believe like I was born an alcoholic, and it didn't become clear to me until I drank alcohol when I was in college, but I always just sort of felt, I think, just a sense of like total insecurity, never quite being comfortable in my own skin, and was so concerned constantly about what other people thought of me. And so when I got to college, it was like, okay, here's alcohol. I finally have reprieve from being in my head all the time. And so it was like I could instantly turn off all that noise. And I went to a small school down south called Swanee that is notoriously a very big party school. I was in a sorority, kind of did that whole thing. So we were drinking, Thursday through Sunday every single week. And I really learned to drink in a place where binge drinking was the norm. And so I think it took me a lot longer to get to the point of being like, oh, this is a problem, because in my head I was constantly just comparing myself to other people and being like, well, I don't drink as much as X, or, I'm still making good grades in college, so it can't be a problem. And I just had all these preconceived notions about what having a problem with alcohol would look like. And so I think it definitely took me a long time to get to that point.
And so, like, what I'm hearing is that your relationship with alcohol started as like filling some sort of void, and almost as if it was immediately problematic versus, I guess, an alternative path would be, take a few sips, start drinking casually, and then it spirals maybe out of control. Is that a misconception that alcoholism can start a lot more abruptly and earlier in its onset in the way that you described?
I think everyone's experience is different. A common saying in recovery is with alcohol, like, first it's fun, then it's fun with problems, and then it's just problems. And so I think everyone has kind of a different pathway to like their rock bottom and what they would consider to be the point where they have their come to Jesus and are like, okay, I might actually have a problem with this. But yeah, I think everyone's different. I think at the beginning, like, alcohol was completely my solution, because my problem, as I saw it, wasn't that I was drinking too much. My problem is that I was thinking too much, and the drinking shut that off. And so I was very easily able to kind of manipulate my own thinking into saying like, oh, I feel like alcohol is actually making me a better and more palatable person.
So what do you mean by thinking too much? Like, what's that behind the hood?
Yeah, so I think a few different things. So I've kind of always run a little bit more anxious. I think it's a lot about like I have OCD, so kind of like this obsession, right, with perfectionism and trying to make everything okay all the time. And I think that just led me to living in my head a lot and worrying so much about what other people think. And so it just sort of snowballed into a bigger and bigger issue. And when I got to college and was so worried, right, about like, okay, now I have to make friends. So there's a social aspect, and then academically I have to do well to maintain my scholarship, and there were sort of all these things putting pressure, or that I was putting an inordinate amount of pressure on myself to do in ways to succeed, that it just like was constantly this loop of like, you're not good enough, you're not doing enough in my head. And so drinking was the way that I got out of that self-talk.
Yeah, no, because I was going to actually, to MD's point, was going to ask you the question you had mentioned earlier on, all that, I think you mentioned there's like all that noise in the head, and you're kind of shutting it off. So my question was like, what's kind of going on up there? Like, what thoughts are going on? And I think what you said, what I heard is it just, we can convince ourselves of virtually anything. I mean, we can convince ourselves that everything's going wrong in our lives, and we'll find it. But we also can do the opposite. But once we get stuck in that trap, if you will, whether it's something, an addiction or whatever it might be, it can be very difficult to get out of that cycle. I guess when did you realize like, oh, there might be a problem here? Maybe not necessarily to the point where you fully hit your rock bottom where you decided like enough is enough, but when was it like, all right, like this is making me maybe not as good of a person as I thought it was?
Yeah, I think that was, it was a few years out of college. So again, really didn't think I had an issue in college. I like graduated, summa cum laude. Like I had all the things that made me think, right, that I was just doing really well. And then when I kind of got out into the real world, I was able to sort of write off my drinking as like, well, I just graduated college and I'm spending time with all these people I went to college with, and we all drink the same. But it was actually kind of, I would say, the latter half of COVID that things became kind of apparent to me. So I was living with someone that I was dating at the time, and unfortunately it turned into a pretty unsafe situation, and my parents came and moved me out in the middle of the night, and when I got home, I realized like, oh, I've been drinking like 2+ bottles of wine a day just to cope with this, because I was so miserable like in my situation. And I think we all had the excuse of saying like, oh, it's COVID, like everyone's just home and everybody's drinking right now. So to me, I was always able to find a reason to drink. And I think another big facet of it is that I just had this huge mindset of being a victim, right? Like I didn't want to take any responsibility for any situation that I ended up in, any decision that I was making that put me in these places, in these spaces where I didn't feel well. And so to me, like, if you had lived the life that I had lived, and if you were going through the things I was going through, like, you would drink like me too. But it took, I would say, I think another 2 years from that point for me to finally reach a point that was low enough that I got sober. But I think from that point on, it was a little tough, right? Because I was still drinking a ton, but there was like this little seed almost planted in the back of my head where I was like, okay, I can't really do this with like the carefreeness that I was doing it before, because I know that something about this isn't right.
So to work towards a place like free of this sort of addiction, and given how it's like connected to just like other deeper rooted parts of your life, like what surprised you the most in terms of like where you had to really focus your energy to maybe, correct other parts of your life or improve other parts of your life to help with this process of like divorcing alcohol?
Yeah, it's a really
before we
good...
go there, can we? So you led us to the rock bottom or up to it. Now, can you just kind of like, what is this rock bottom moment? What's going through your head? And then from there, we could take, MD's question of what you kind of learned, what you come out of there.
Yeah, for sure. So my rock bottom moment, it's probably would sound pretty banal to a bunch of other things that happened when I was in active addiction, but I had recently gotten back on Lexapro, so an SSRI, and as you know, when you're on those, you're really not supposed to drink. But I was like, oh, that's just what they say about every medication that you get on. And I just started to spiral into having like panic attacks every single day. And it just became absolutely debilitating. And I struggled a lot with just like suicidal ideation too. And I reached a point one night, it was like any other night, I was having the same fight with my now ex-boyfriend that I've been having, I felt like every night up until that point. And I woke up the next morning with this crippling hangover and was like, I'm either going to end my life or I need to stop drinking. And that was just like the clarity that I needed to make a different choice.
Dang. I'm going to either end my life or I'm going to stop drinking.
Yeah, well, I think those are kind of, they talk about alcoholism, right? Is like it's really you're drinking yourself to death. It's a way that you try to disconnect with the world around you, and it's like deeply rooted in like something about me is not right, or like I there's something wrong between me and the rest of the world, and it's yeah. So I truly believe that I was either going to die from drinking or I was going to get sober.
And I guess what led you to choose stop drinking? Why not the other choice? Like, and are you speaking to anybody else at this point? Is this all a battle going on just with you yourself? How do you get to kind of make the decision to keep going, keep fighting?
Yeah, I mean, we all have our different set of beliefs. I believe that I like do believe in a power greater than myself, and I think that, someone was looking out for me that day. I don't think it was anything that I did. I really do think it was a miracle that it happened, and I just received like this moment of clarity that was like, let's try this thing that we are so afraid of. And I think up until that point, my greatest fear in life was never being able to drink again. And then I finally felt a fear that was bigger than that, which is I might spend the rest of my life drinking. And that felt scarier in that moment.
Wow. I don't even have any much more. MD, go ahead, ask your insightful question now. I knew there was a good story behind it, but that's powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, with the relationship to alcohol and like how it started, I think it's more than just like this casual craving of the feelings that it comes with, but there are probably parts of you as a whole body person that you had to work through, whether, there's traumatic experiences in the past, self-perception of how you see yourself, right? Like, what surprised you in terms of what you had to really work on to be able to actually successfully divorce alcohol?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think before I got sober, I really felt like everything in life was happening to me, right? Like, again, this just omnipresent victim mindset where I was like, okay, this assault happened when I was in high school, and that's the reason that I drink. Or, I didn't get this grade that I wanted in college, and that's the reason that I drink. Or this friend mistreated me. Like, all of these sorts of things I could use to validate the drinking. And when I got into recovery, I realized that my problem was really that I had this obsession with being a victim, right? Like, it was easy to say, oh, I can't believe how many like crappy guys that I've dated and how they've treated me. But actually I knew exactly who they were when I started dating them, but I was continuing to make choices that validated like this internal narrative that I had, that like I was a victim and my life was about suffering, and that would all give me kind of like this fuel and fodder to just continue to drink and sort of railroad my life, because that was a lot more comfortable to me than actually trying to like just like be okay with being Elizabeth.
And then I saw a piece of your content talking about how at its peak, like drinking your life away, you had mentioned that like it being associated with this idea of living small. So I guess like how do we explain that to people in terms of like what your life is like when you're living small, and take the alcohol out of it, right? Like your everyday life. What did it mean to you to be living small, and like how does that contrast to how you live today?
So I think another really big misconception I had when I was drinking is that drinking gave me this very big and exciting life. It's like, oh, I spend a lot of time socially going out with people, and I'm going to all these concerts and like we're day drinking, and it's the way that I've built my community. And what I didn't have the clarity to see at that point was that every decision I made in life, everywhere I went, every person I spent time around, it was all determined by alcohol. It was like, is there going to be alcohol there? Can I drink? Do these people drink like I drink? Are they going to judge me, or are they going to, keep up with me? And so when I got sober, I was so scared that I was like, I'm not going to have any friends. I'm 26. What am I going to do? I'm going to be so boring. And it was like, oh, I finally get to sit in the driver's seat of my life for the first time and begin to figure out who I am without the alcohol. Because alcohol was like, that was the be all end all for me. And it's really hard to see when you're in the thick of it. And then it becomes really obvious when you're on the other side. And I think I also just had this enormous ego where I was like, well, I'm doing such a good job at hiding my alcoholism. Like I'm keeping this job, I'm getting promotion, like all this sort of stuff. Trust me, when I got sober, I went to my parents and I was like, I'm going to my first AA meeting. They were like, thank God.
So I guess, like, what does that process look like? You mentioned being in the driver's seat for the first time in your life and figuring out who you really were. I think there's a lot of people that can probably relate to not having a clue on who they are. And I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I don't know what I'm passionate about. I don't know my hobbies. I don't know my purpose, all this stuff. And so how has that process taken shape in your life?
It's a good question. I think there are a few ways that this has happened. When I was drinking, it was centered around alcohol, but it was also centered around me, right? Like it's my problems, it's like everything is me all the time. Everything's happening to me, everyone has wronged me. And when I got sober, it finally gave me the opportunity to start to show up for other people. And so I think at the beginning I was like, oh, I need to find hobbies. That's how I'm going to figure out who I am. But it really was like, who am I in relationship to other people, and who am I when I take kind of like myself out of the center of the equation and I start to center like showing up for other people. And I think that really helped me. And I probably don't even know who I am, but I know when I look at myself in the mirror now, I'm okay with who I am. I didn't used to be able to do that. It's like I show up in ways that I can look back at and be proud of. I respond to situations in ways that are far more level. And that's really the miracle of getting sober. It has nothing to do with not drinking, and it has everything to do with like just being able to show up for people finally.
Yeah, and that, before we go ahead and you ask a question, MD, it just reminds me of the quote. I forgot what it is. It might have been by Gandhi, but it was really to find yourself, basically lose yourself in the service of other people.
I love that.
And I think that basically that is exactly what you just shared, and it's definitely played true in my life as well. Go ahead, MD. I just wanted to make that little connection.
Yeah, no, I was, because you'd mentioned like fear of what people would think, and you become this really boring person. So like, how did environment play a role in your journey, and like, did it inhibit you from sobriety sooner? What did you have to change about your environment, if at all?
I'd say sitting here now with like a little over 2 years, I've basically changed everything about my environment. But at the beginning, it wasn't much initially. I thought originally like, oh, the only thing I have to do is stop drinking and my life is just going to get better. So I was still dating someone that was drinking. I was spending time around people that were drinking. I was going to bars. Like I was doing all the stuff I was doing before I just took out alcohol. And the more sobriety I got and the more recovered I got, I realized like this isn't fulfilling me. Like this just doesn't hit the way that it used to. And so I just started to become more comfortable with the idea of like, what would it look like to just start doing things that feel good and make me feel secure in myself versus caring so much about how it may look to other people.
What were some of the earliest things that you were drawn to? Like, what did you start to do that was in a different direction, if you will?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and I know everyone has their own opinions about it, but that was going to 12-step. Like that is really been the bread and butter of my recovery. And I often say, I think a lot of people were okay with me not drinking. A lot of people were uncomfortable with me being sober and like working a 12-step program. Because I think we've all kind of been imbued, right, with these ideas of like what an alcoholic looks like and how you get to that point and how you end up in that room. But to me, that is truly what saved my life. And so I'm careful, like I don't talk in too much detail about it, right? Because it's like anonymous, and that's like one of the tenets of the program. But I do try to like allude to it in a way to normalize it, so like especially other people my age are like, oh, there are people that are like in their 20s that are getting sober, and it's not just like all my friends' parents.
And so, I mean, you have a very personal experience and relationship with alcohol, and now that you're at where you're at today, and you see kind of alcohol being as normalized as it is in society around you, like how has your like I guess perspective of that world around you, how has that evolved over time? Do you take up more awareness of like, wow, this is very dangerously normalized, right? Like, what are some of your current thoughts? Because I know that you create content now and like you're trying to be louder about this topic. Like, how do you view, I guess, alcohol and the world more broadly, beyond yourself?
I have no moral qualms with alcohol. I think that's like the biggest thing I try to express to people, right? Is like, I don't care if anyone else drinks. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with alcohol. Like, I don't process alcohol like other people, and I can't drink, but I really have no judgment on anyone else who does. I think more so, like, what my goal is to normalize, like, if you feel like it's become a problem in your life, like, it is okay to stop, and there are ways to stop, and like there is a life after getting sober, because that's really where I was tunneled. Is I didn't know a single sober person when I stopped drinking. And I think that's the amazing part about social media now, right? Is like you're able to connect with people online and like normalize these things that sometimes can feel so isolating. But yeah, I don't know, I think more than anything, it makes me a little sad sometimes, because I remember just how stuck I felt, and just like how little of my life that I was living when I was drinking. And so I think seeing other people like clearly suffering from the same thing it can be challenging, but I also am a strong believer that like no one is ready to get sober until they're ready to get sober. There's nothing I can do, there's nothing you can do, there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to get somebody sober. Like, it is such a deeply personal journey and decision.
I think there's a pretty important distinction that at least just kind of jumped out to me, what you just said, which is, and I don't even think you realize you said it, but you said, like, I can't drink, but I don't judge others that can. And I think just like that frame at least differentiates in my head from someone that maybe truly was an alcoholic to someone that, like me, I always knew drinking wasn't serving me, and I binged, I did the whole college experience, but I never really liked it, and I never felt like it had any sort of control over me. And when I chose to stop drinking, largely for my health, I mean, for the most part, over a year ago, it was very simple. Like, I never had a craving for it. But what you said is, like, I can't drink, versus from someone like myself that maybe never had that problem, like you said, like, growing up, is like, I just I choose not to. Like, I could, and I'd have no problem stopping again. So I think that's a very important distinction. I want to go back to when you mentioned, the 12-step program. What's it like to walk in that room for the first time?
I mean, I didn't even know if it was a real thing. I was like, I've heard of this, like in TV shows before, right? Like everyone's just sitting in a basement. But it was really scary. And it took me a couple weeks to build up the courage to actually go. And I think it's because I put a lot of shame on myself, right? It's kind of like you're saying, right? Like, it was one thing for me to walk around and be like, oh, I'm just not drinking anymore, and like I'm doing it for like health reasons, and that wouldn't be true for me, right? Like that wasn't the real reason that I wasn't drinking. And so to me, going into those rooms was like, okay, I'm finally truly admitting like who I am and what I am, and that felt really scary. But it was also like that was one of the best days of my life, because I felt all of this relief all of a sudden. It was like I have spent all of this time trying to figure out like what's quote unquote wrong with me. And now I can finally say like, oh, that is what is wrong with me. I'm an alcoholic. And now I literally have a program that I can work that will help me navigate life, knowing who I am and how my brain works.
So with that sort of like focus on trying to fix something that feels broken, and going through that process, what are like some of the hidden gems that you learned of yourself through that? Like, what have you learned of like who you are when you're able to kind of demask away from this, you know, identity of, you know, alcoholism, and like what did you learn about who you are?
Deep question. Who am I? So I mean, I know I'm kind of harping on this now, but I really think breaking free of that victim mindset was like the biggest unlock that I had. I felt very powerless in my life before. And I think the difference I learned is between like a feeling of powerlessness and uselessness versus surrender, right? And like powerlessness is feeling like, oh, everything is happening to me and I'm a victim of my circumstances. And surrender is saying like, I am small, like I am just one person and I'm just going to flow with life a little bit more and stop feeling like everything is happening to me and just kind of start to participate in the flow of life. So I think that was a big change for me, is realizing that I have a lot more agency than I ever imagined. And I don't have to I don't have to be miserable. I think that was so much of my identity before. And it was like, okay, I'm diagnosed with like anxiety and depression in college. And I think in some ways I sort of used that as almost like a bit of a crutch. So I could act out and not really like chase things that I wanted and live to my full potential, because I'm like, well, obviously I can't, like, I'm depressed and I'm really anxious. And it just gave me the freedom to make a different choice. And I think people sometimes, or at least I, like, conflated a bit this idea of like the scariest or like the scariest thing is having like anxiety or depression. And I think actually the bigger fear that I had was being really honest and going after what I want and like possibly not getting it. I think that I was like very attached to like the devil I knew, right? And so if I'm not really setting goals for myself and I'm like always just sort of I don't know. Yeah, if I'm just like not challenging myself and I'm okay with being kind of miserable, like that's something that I understand and I know and I won't be disappointed, versus if I actually put in effort and go after something that I want, like I might fail and I might be disappointed, and like wouldn't that be so much worse? But I found that it's much better to fail.
It really reminds me of part of a quote that I share at every event that I do. And it's, our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. And it's our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. And I think that just was very well, that summarizes what you just said, at least from what I heard. I guess when you say surrendering to the flow of life, letting go, kind of shifting your mindset, what role, maybe in the 12-step process, but just more generally speaking for you personally, what role does spirituality play in that, if at all?
Huge role. I would say that's definitely become the foundation of my life. I had to unlearn like having all of these expectations, right? And like expectations in the sense that I know people are generally very honest and straightforward about who they are. And so if they are who they are and I'm disappointed by it, it's not their fault, it's mine, right? Because I'm expecting them to act differently or be different than who they are at their core. And so just being able to like release expectations and also release like resentments was so important for me. I think like one thing that is just like really important that I picked up is that we talk about them as being resentments, things, people, places, institutions that we're frustrated with. But at its core, it's like, how willing am I to give up my power to people, places, and things constantly? Like if somebody is, honks at me because I'm not going fast enough at a green light and I get really frustrated with them, and it is like just then my entire day spirals out after that. Like how crazy is that I am like that willing to give away my power to like somebody that I don't even know in this super benign situation. And so being able to just let go and be like, okay, that's just the way that it is, and believe that like I don't have to figure everything out and I don't have to be ultra stressed and like try to hold on to everything so tightly, because if it's meant to be mine, it will be mine. And if it's not, like there is a plan beyond my own understanding and conception. And like thank God, because if I were living in like Elizabeth's will all the time, I would still be drinking.
Go ahead, Emily.
And so, I mean, given all of this, I guess how, because you mentioned you have a career, you work 9 to 5. Now you're also now creating content, and it seems like you want to further platform your experiences, your learnings. Why is that important to you? And, you know, tangentially, like, how has your sense of like passion and purpose evolved over time given these experiences?
It's a good question. Have done a lot of, I feel like, reflection over the past year on how I feel I can be most useful to other people. I spent vast majority of my life like so obsessed and wrapped in self and like asking like what's best for me, what's best for me. I have found that just being like a worker among workers and like embracing sort of like the monotony and the normalcy of life and not feeling like everything has to be like super special and I have to be super unique, I think is the way that I can actually be most useful to other people, because like my hope is that people can see me. It's like, okay, I'm, you know, at 28, like working this regular 9 to 5 job, like everything in my life is pretty standard and I still have these issues and I can still address them on the outside. Yeah, so I guess it's like maintaining hopefully like some level of relatability. And I don't know. And I also think like in my work environment too, like it's not just about like going onto social media and talking about sobriety. Like for me, the tenets of my recovery show up in my everyday life at work. It's like, how can I like be of service and go out of my way and be kind and like be somebody that like builds up the culture at my workplace? Like all of these things have become so important to me, especially because I was just like such a nightmare for so long too.
What was the most challenging part of getting sober? Maybe what still is of staying sober?
Oh, that is a good question. I think it was just, and like this is right, like the saying in sobriety where like everything is one day at a time. I am really prone to future tripping. So if I think today, like I'm going to be sober until the day that I die, like that is a very stressful thought for me. I'm like, how am I going to do that? That sounds horrible. So it's really being able to just kind of like take life on life's terms, just say today's today and know that like I'm going to figure out tomorrow and not try to like obsess so much about needing to like, I don't know, try to work everything out.
What was the most challenging part of getting sober in the first place?
I think for me, it was just not drinking. Like, I mean, everybody's
like
different.
The withdrawals and all that.
Yeah, it's just like I didn't realize how deeply rooted it was in my life. Everything I did revolved around alcohol, all the ways that I interacted with people socially, the things I did on the weekends, like it all revolved around alcohol. And I think it was kind of jarring when I took that out of the equation to see like kind of how little I had left after I did that.
I've also seen that you've taken up running. I guess, I mean, that's a physically active thing to do, and I like to think of all things health and wellness being multidimensional, interconnected. I like to think that running can certainly help with somebody who's trying to journey into more sobriety, right? Like there's probably some correlating effect there. I'm just curious, like, how has running served you and physical movement, and has that always been something that you had done during your more rock bottom time of life, or is this something that has sort of popped into your life as you've maybe uncovered yourself more authentically?
I was always a pretty physically active person, but I think while I was kind of in my active addiction, physical exercise was sort of always a punishment for like my body's not good enough, I'm not disciplined enough, like this is kind of like a means to an end. And then when I got sober, one of the biggest things I realized as well is that I was totally unable to keep a single promise when I was drinking. I would never be able to follow through on anything, and and that included myself, and it was probably at the detriment of myself the most. And so when I stopped drinking, I didn't really have any hobbies, so I needed something to fill the time. And B, I think signing up for a race, right, was like, this is something I never could have done when I was drinking. So it was this way that I could actually see something through. So I ran, I think I ran like a 10K and then a half marathon. And then I ran my first marathon like right before I hit a year sober, and it was just
Dang.
yeah, it was just like a very spiritual experience for me. And I think like with running too, it's so much about just being with your own thoughts, and it's about, it gets really gritty, and it's a lot of times like it's not fun, but it's kind of this, in my experience, like this unparalleled feeling of like euphoria and accomplishment when you cross that finish line.
What would you say to someone that's listening to this and they're like, man, I really resonate with Elizabeth's story, and I'm kind of at a similar point. I don't think drinking's serving me anymore, but I don't believe I have it in me, or I don't know what's on the other side of not drinking. I don't know who I'm going to be, all the things. What would you say to that person?
I'd say I've been there. I completely understand fear, and I think like fear was the primary driver for why I drank, and the biggest step that I took was just admitting that I had a problem and having the willingness to ask for help. I think like a lot of us are conditioned to think that asking for help equates to weakness, and that if we can't figure it out or muscle through it on our own, that somehow we are lesser of a person. And I have realized that like my greatest strength has come in being able to like lean on a community and build a community, and we grow closer to other people and we grow into a better version of ourselves when we're able to be vulnerable and ask for help, and like be okay with people maybe not seeing us perfectly or the way that we want to be perceived too, right? Like letting go of this obsession with image maintenance and needing people to like think that we're something that we're not.
Yeah, so I mean, number one, I want to just thank you and for being as open about your life as you've been with us. Like, I think that there's reason that you do that, and I think it's to serve others. With everything that you've experienced, you've come such a long way. I'm curious, like, if you had a magic wand, is there anything that you would change about that experience from, I guess, what you would identify as a starting point to today?
I think if I would change anything, it would just be like, I wish I had stayed more present in the beginning. I think that when I first got sober, like I was so concerned about like reaching milestones, and I was so concerned about like, okay, am I doing enough? Am I accomplishing enough? Because I went from this place of feeling like, okay, I've lived my life up to this point kind of being like this useless, mopey, like victim person. And now I'm sober. I don't really have any excuses anymore. So I kind of felt like this frantic need to do everything. And so that's why even right with like running a marathon and stuff, like I want people to know that you do not need to run a marathon because you get sober. Like that's not that's not a thing most people do. A lot of that has to do with like my need to I don't know, like feel like I'm the best at something. And so, which is totally a character defect I need to work on. But I think it would just be being okay with not having it all figured out at the beginning, and like trusting that I would realize things and be able to make decisions when the time was right. Because I wasn't ready. Like I think I wanted to change my entire life the second I got sober, right? I was like, I don't want to talk to anyone from my previous life. I'm gonna like break with a boyfriend, change my job, like all this sort of stuff. And it was just like, just be patient.
I think that's such a good message more broadly. I think we always feel like we're behind in life, or people are going quicker than us. But what I've seen to be true in my life is whatever pace is going to keep you moving forward is the right pace. Because if you're not ready, I mean, you won't receive what's in front of you, you know? And so I think everyone has to go at their own pace, or you'll get so overwhelmed that you end up going backwards and you end up going the wrong direction. And so at least for my, like, you're not familiar, but the people that listen to this show, my journey of coming out, it's been a very slow and steady. I mean, there's the whole, of course, like the actually doing it, leads to, it's pretty transformative in itself, but then it's very slow and steady in terms of just my process. But I've always trusted my process, because while sometimes it feels quote unquote slow, it's still progress, and any progress is good progress. So I love that you said that. And also the point I wrote down, you were talking about getting help, and it just made me think of, again, myself, and to your point, always viewing it as a sign of weakness, meaning I can't do this life on my own, which I don't think anyone can in the first place anyway, or is. But what I saw to be true in my life, and maybe this is true for you, maybe it's not, is there are so many people that want to support you on the other side of that, but we have to be willing to ask for that support. Have you seen that to be true? Were you like, I don't know, for me, I was like, I had all these people that were like so supportive when I thought they wouldn't be, or wouldn't even came out of the woodworks. Did you have any sort of experience like that where you were maybe just, you got support and you didn't even realize like you were going to get it?
100%. I think so much of like my internalized shame, I projected onto other people, right? I was like, I remember my dad came to visit this past summer, and I said to him, like, I was so scared that you were just going to be so ashamed of me when I told you I was an alcoholic. And he's like, I'd never been more proud. And I think that was just amazing for me to hear. Is he's like, I was so proud of you for like getting help and identifying a problem and like choosing not to suffer and not to have people around you suffer anymore.
Damn, how'd that make you feel? That just gave me chills.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience, you know? To have someone tell you that they're proud of you over something you're most shameful of, I mean, it rocked my world.
100%. And I think it was such an important reminder to like, I spend so much time assuming what people think without ever asking them, right? Like most conversations that happen between me and another person are in my head. Like I never even ask them. So, you know, and I think that was like, you know, the biggest thing that came out of my sobriety is like my relationship with my dad healed, because I had just kind of made him like this boogeyman for no fault of his own, because I felt so ashamed and upset and like I was constantly disappointing him. But really what it boiled down to is like he didn't want me to be anything but like a healthy, healed version of myself.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, how like loved ones, they ultimately want the best for you. It's pretty much regardless of what that journey looks like, the labels that maybe you attach your identity to along the way. So, I guess, one of the things I take away from just getting to know you in just under an hour here is that you're a hyperachiever. There's perfectionism. And I imagine that shows up in your marathon. Like, I'm pretty sure one of your pieces of content said that you ran another one and set like a PR or something. And I guess, like, what are you still working on for yourself? There's kind of this evergreen growth that I feel like you might be pursuing. And I just want to know, like, what are your biggest challenges today? Like, what are you working on for yourself today?
Well, you definitely clocked it. My biggest area for growth is just believing that without anything, without any accomplishments, without any achievements, like, I am enough and I'm worthy of love, I'm worthy of support, I'm worthy of my sobriety, which is like so hard, right? Because we completely assume that like people are only going to love us or be proud of us if we're like constantly achieving. And so just letting go of that, not there yet, don't know if I'll ever be there, but I'll try, I think that is definitely the biggest area of growth that I have, because I'm very hard on myself still.
Yeah, that's prime short form material right there, Matt. We asked that question. I just knew Elizabeth was going to have a bar drop there on that one.
Well, you're just speaking my language. I mean, that's really a lot of what I talk about when I go and speak to college students. Mm-hmm. Is that sometimes the most productive thing you can do for yourself is just sit back and be still.
Yeah.
And be present.
Yeah.
And just let yourself enjoy wherever the heck you are. I feel like there's so much beauty that life has to offer in the present moment. And just the littlest would feel like little moments to a lot of us that we just so take for granted. And the more that we can just slow down and recognize that it's our birth, we're worthy. It was our birthright.
100%.
We didn't choose to be here. We were brought here. And we're worthy for that and alone. And I think with the more that we can truly embody that, life just becomes even more freeing and more peaceful. And so I love that you shared that. I guess, what does it mean to become, I think you wrote something, and then we'll kind of wrap up, but what does it mean to become a person you actually like? Because that's very similar to my brand tagline, if you will, which is learning to enjoy your own company. Mm-hmm. So I would just love to hear from your perspective, like, what does that mean to you?
Oh, good question. Becoming a person I actually like, I really think it's what I said before, which is like I can look in the mirror and like be okay with myself, and I can stand behind decisions that I make and things that I do. So for me, it's really been like how do I maintain being a person of my word? How can I be trustworthy? And I was not someone that was able to show up for anyone or anything before, and I've you know, it's a total cliche, but I do believe that like just showing up is most of the problem. And that's the way that we build community, we build relationships, we build trust with and among other people. And I think the other is, I heard this on, I'm trying to remember which podcast it was. I was listening to a podcast the other week, and it was saying like, whenever you're faced with a decision, you can come at it as in one of two ways. I can either operate from my higher self or my lower self. And I feel like if I'm choosing to operate from my higher self more days than not, like I am on a good path, because it used to be constantly operating from my ego and like, how can I get what I want out of things? And now it's more so like, what would showing up in a way that I can be proud of look like? And usually that's not being selfish and just like wanting to go after things that will benefit me.
And I think, you know, what I heard is like honesty. Can you be honest with yourself? I mean,
totally.
And not disappoint yourself. And at least in my life, if I can be honest and truthful and make decisions from that place and be truthful with others as well with my word, I usually am okay with my decisions. I mean, they don't always go the way I want them to or how I think they should, but I can look at myself in the mirror or put my head on the pillow and be like, all right, like I was honest, didn't work out, whatever it might be. But you at least have a sense of inner peace. I think I might have listened to that conversation too, because I remember someone talking about lower self. I can't remember what it was, but I think we may have listened to the same podcast. Anyway, MD, you got anything else? All right, well then we're going to hit you with a doozy. Our last question we ask everybody. It's a fun one. It's an easy one. What are you most proud of in life?
My sobriety, bar none. Yeah, my sobriety and most importantly now is my relationship with my family. It was something that I just really didn't have before. You know, my parents have always been loving and supportive, but I have like a real relationship with them now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Wow, what an answer. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your vulnerability, and for sharing your story.
And thanks so much for having me.